Hi, everyone. Welcome to the future of CI, from 2020 to what's next. I'm Cynthia Cheng, Correia, President of the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows, and I'm delighted to welcome you. And I also want to thank our sponsors, Aurora WDC, Fletcher CSI, Bennion Group, the Business Intelligence Source, Tyson Hines, and Knowledge Inform for making this event possible. And so welcome to this CI 2020 Summit, our very first summit. And this event was conceived in 2019 to develop new ways to support CI practitioners around the globe. It is significant to the CI Fellows, and we hope the CI practice community in many ways. It marks the start of our CI 2020 Summit series, and it gives us a meaningful way to celebrate 30 years of the CI Fellows. Our celebration isn't simply an event to congratulate the first CI Fellows. It's a recognition of where we've come and a collective examination of where we're headed and the roles we play in shaping and leading our practices in new ways. As we do this, we draw on the initiative, vision, and spirit of the founders of this field, many of them the first CI Fellows, to consider challenging questions, solve complex and evolving problems, and find ways to guide, lead, and shape CI. While competitive intelligence has always tackled tough questions, conditions, and decisions, we face today in the foreseeable future deeply complex conditions and challenges. Recent events have surfaced challenging questions and hard truths in many facets of our lives and practices. They've tested our capabilities, resiliency, and adaptability, and shone spotlights on our preparedness. As we meet and keep ahead of challenging events and outcomes, we continue to learn and adapt and to develop deeper understanding and insights, to find new paths and solutions. And we continue to embrace fresh perspectives, redefinitions, and new directions in the evolution of CI and our environments. We've chosen the theme of this first CI 2020 Summit with this in mind. As we take stock of where we are and explore the future of CI, we establish a foundation for the future summits that will dive deeply into specific topics, issues, and challenges shaping our CI practices, our companies, industries, societies, and the globe. We will bring together experts and look at how AI and other technology are changing CI and the world around us. We will look at how to expand our ability to generate foresight and anticipate developments. We will discuss how we can sharpen our ability to develop deeper insights into industry, organizations, and their drivers. As a part of our celebrating 30 years of the CI Fellows, this event also helps us launch new ways to support and educate on CI practice, which is the core mission of the CI Fellows. We're thrilled to open our CI Community of Practice, or CI-COP, on the Slack platform. This CI-COP was created in response to the many questions we've received in our monthly webinars and in talking with CI practitioners and mentees. Unlike webinars, the community of practice is always on. We can launch and shape discussions, share resources, consult with trusted colleagues and experts. For this summit, the CI-COP is an extension of our discussions. I'm also delighted to share that we've launched the first of our CI Fellows interview series with the release of Clifford Kalb's interview with Dr. John Prescott. As you know, John is celebrating his 30th year as CI Fellow, and he sat down with Cliff, who has interviewed more leading CI practitioners than anyone, for an enlightening and thought-provoking interview. Expect more interviews of CI Fellows and other experts to come, including a mutual interview of Babette Ben-Susan and Craig Fleischer, well known for their collaboration on a number of books on CI analysis. In the meantime, you can find the links for John's two-part interview on page 5 of your summit program and on the CI Fellows website, cifellows.com. Now, I want to take this time to congratulate our first CI Fellows, pardon me, Robert Pfeiffer, Leonard Fuld, Jan Herring, and John Prescott. These fellows are among the founders of this discipline, many of whom are also longtime fellows. Foundational methods, tools, and practices were introduced or developed by these early practitioners who also founded and established the Society of Competitive Intelligence Professionals, SCIP, now the Strategic and Competitive Intelligence Professionals, and they developed competitive intelligence as we know and practice it. So with this, I want to introduce John Prescott, a founder, educator, author and pioneer, and one of the most deeply respected colleagues in our field. John.
Thank you, Cynthia, and welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to be here and spend a couple minutes with you before we go to Liam's keynote speech. One of the first things I want to do is congratulate the other fellows in the first class, Jan, Lenny, and Bob, and congratulate all the fellows. It's a very big accomplishment, and it's something I think all of us are very proud to have earned and be associated with. One of the things that Cynthia asked me to do for a few minutes is reflect on the 30 years, and it kind of blew my mind because 30 years is a long time to think about it, and I really kind of think forward, and so it kind of put me in a place to think, okay, what did we really do? And these are my ideas, and I think other fellows would be able to fill in other blanks and have some of their own perspectives on this. But what I tried to do is focus on milestones. And for example, this conference is a milestone, I think, in the establishment of the fellows. And I want to congratulate Cynthia and Claudia and all the players who have really put this together. So how did we actually get here? I think one of the people that really have to be pointed out is Bob Margulies, who worked for McDonnell Douglas at the time, because Bob, when we were on SCIP, was really the champion for putting together awards, whatever type of awards we had in SCIP. And I don't know who really thought up the fellows notion, but Bob, if we go back to the roots, was somebody who pushed that. And I think that was very important at the time and continues to be very important. Now, as the fellows came into being, I'm going to give you some of the milestones I thought. In the early years, we really didn't do much, to be candid about this. There just wasn't enough of us around. And, you know, we talked with each other and so forth, but there wasn't a critical mass. But as we moved through, you know, 4 or 5 years of this, we did get a critical mass. And at that time, there was 2 things going on that I think pushed us forward. One was Jan, because Jan was always bothering us, and I say that in a very kind way, to do something with all this talent that we had. And this reminds me of something when Cynthia was talking about, it seems like I feel like I'm old and wise now, although that says that I must have been young and stupid for a long time, and sometimes I still am in that way. So Jan was pushing us forward, and at the same time, Tim Kindle from Kodak was often bringing up a very important point. SCIP really focused on entry-level people, and it made a lot of sense because there was a lot of churn in the field. And I mean that in a positive way. People were coming in, moving to other positions, and hopefully, you know, spreading the word about CI throughout organizations. And so Tim really brought up the idea, what about the individuals who were pretty skilled in CI? They didn't really have a place to go to. And I know Liam created one place for them to go to. And I think the CI fellows was another place to go to. So I was very supportive of this idea because it also allowed me to learn from all the fellows as we move forward. I think a second critical milestone was really reached by Tim Powell. Now, what Tim did was he put together the ACME acronym that we use, and I still laugh when I think about it because I think of the Roadrunner notion of Roadrunner in a coyote, and the coyote always used Acme products and never really worked out too well. But in this case, they did. You know, the Acme was advocate, champion, mentor, and educator. And that really set up a kind of a core mission for us and something we could wrap our heads around and wrap around activities around. But what we lacked, which gets to the third point that I want to milestone, was an infrastructure. So during those days, I think it was very important to say, let's get the group together. We met in Chicago for several years, and people such as Joe Goldberg, Wayne Rosencraft, Cliff, obviously, the Aurora brothers, Eric and Derek, and then Craig Fleischer was all very much influential, I think, in getting an infrastructure set up for the fellows. I think the next milestone was when we really incorporated, and I think that was necessary, and Kurt Tyson should be given a lot of credit for really driving that infrastructure and doing the groundwork for what we have. And that led us up to today's conference. And again, I really want to congratulate Cynthia and Claudia and the others who really put this conference together, and all the participants and speakers at the conference. Now, that moves to what do we do moving forward? And I just want to speak on two areas. Move forward is the fellows, because we still are involved with what many people refer to as a stigmatized practice. CI is stigmatized, whether for good or bad. That's what we are, and that stigmatized practice we have to just deal with. And I think there's a couple things that we can do to move forward for the fellows, two areas that I'd like to suggest at least. What we really try to do in CI is impact. And what we try to impact is how individuals and organizations think, how they behave, and how they perform. And to do that, we try to create evidence. But that evidence really, when you think about it, is and that evidence is very much related to evidence-based management. Although if you really look at evidence-based management, it's really, and how it's used, it's really evidence-influenced politics or decision-making. So, and what you see is, and especially in the healthcare area where evidence-based management has a very strong part. I read a report recently by the NRC National, and what they focused on was, this notion that evidence is good, but evidence really just influences the political system. And so what often happens, and this is even within our own organizations, is that politics, internal politics, often defines what is good evidence or what is good scientists. And I think that's a pretty useful lesson. Now, two areas that I think is, and I'll summarize these very quickly, is one is public policy. I think that Skip and the fellows has generally avoided public policy notions, and I think that's at our peril. One particular area that I think we should get into in public policy is intellectual property protection, because I think that's very central to what CI is all about. Intellectual property protection involves patents, trade secrets, copyrights, and trademarks. And it's really also wrapped up into ethics. And so I think we should have a presence in that. The second area is what I refer to as, or what is, counterintelligence. For some reason, we've always avoided getting involved with counterintelligence, but I never really understood it, because if you think about it, it's the flip side. It's the duality with competitive intelligence. It's one's protection on one side and one's trying to penetrate, other corporations and on the other side. And so, I really would like us to see the fellows move more into the counterintelligence domain. We have to do that intellectually, get away from the notion that counterintelligence is just for security. We have to deal with the tools. I know that this conference is dealing with a lot of tools such as AI, social media, and what I call an umbrella of analytical set of tools. And then we have to form alliances with other organizations that really are involved with the counterintelligence effort. So that's my brief set of reflections on the fellows, on some of the milestones, and also a couple areas I would like to see us do as we move forward. And again, I want to congratulate everybody, and I'm looking forward to the next 2 days of sessions and learning from all of you. So thank you very much, and we'll turn it over to Liam.
Great, thanks. Thanks, John, so much for sharing more of your wisdom. I always enjoy hearing you speak because I always learn something new, and it's always thought-provoking. And so I do appreciate what you've shared, and I really do hope that we take your advice. I think that what you share with us is particularly important in nowadays as we're redefining ourselves and finding new paths. And so now it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote, Liam Fahey, who is not only a leading thinker and speaker on leadership and insights, but is a colleague who's been a supporter of CI, someone who not only inspires deep respect for his work and insights, but who is highly regarded and admired for his own leadership, collegiality, and character. In the same year in which the first cohort of the CI Fellows were inducted, Liam was the recipient of SCIP's first meritorious award. Many of you also know him as the co-founder and partner of Leadership Forum and the creator and leader of its Intelligence Leadership Forum. Some of you may have been his students at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, at Boston University, or at Babson College, where he is professor of management practice today. His work focuses on enabling organizations to win in the marketplace through enhanced marketplace intelligence and insight, and his books, articles, and award-winning papers have guided and inspired practitioners, educators, and researchers. His most recent book, The Insight Discipline, has just been published, and I'm delighted to welcome Liam Fahey. Liam.
How are you? Hello to everybody as I'm setting up here. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's preparing this presentation. Can everybody hear me? Preparing this presentation has also caused me, like John Prescott, to do a little reflection and retrospective analysis of the last 30 plus years, taking me all the way back to the first CI competitor intelligence class that I put together at Kellogg School of Management back in 1983. And it was there that I first connected with my good buddy and friend, Jan Herring. And one of the things that I talked about in that class, believe it or not, is the focus of the presentation today, which is how do we prepare our minds for intelligence work? Why should we even bother to prepare our minds for intelligence work? But I can remember back in those classes, and maybe there's a student or two listening to me, if they are, they can keep quiet, where I was literally hounding these poor students to think about what they needed to do to get themselves prepared mentally, conceptually, to do intelligence-like work. And here we are, almost 40 years later, still addressing the same set of topics, the same kinds of issues. I know the practice of intelligence has obviously advanced considerably since then. Okay. Here's my agenda for this session. And please don't presume that I'm going to cover these in any kind of sequence, because I'm going to be jumping back and forth and all over the place. But I thought I'd give you a little hint as to where I'm headed by addressing what we mean by preparing the mind, some precepts about the mind, some issues got to do with mental models and why they creep into issues got to do with preparing the mind, some analysis issues and questions. Particularly want to address the whole area of the interaction between analysis methods and deliberations, and leave you with a little action agenda. And one of the things I'd like you to do as I start here is choose an analysis project that you're currently working on right now. Just bring to mind or put on paper some piece of work that you're doing in the intelligence area. And I will have you reflect on that in multiple ways as we go through. And where I want to start is pretty simple, but of major import. There's no news here to any of us. But basically, we're looking at a world that's getting increasingly complex, increasingly interrelated, increasingly connected. It's no longer we're no longer able to take a mechanical view of this world. It's very much interactive. It's very much festooned with disruptions, discontinuities, and you name it. That's the world we're in, that's the world we're heading in, and that's the world we're always going to be involved in. And this is where I usually like to start conversations about getting the mind ready, because here now comes the question: are our minds prepared to deal with this kind of world? And what we usually do is we'll take those 6 verbs you see on the left-hand side, and we'll ask some very powerful questions got to do with our minds. None of them are easy to answer, but all of them are highly relevant. Because what we're asking ourselves here at a very general level initially, what do we really mean by being prepared? Having our minds prepared to deal with this rather complex world. How do we see the world? What do we think about? How do we think? What is it we're trying to achieve, both from an intelligence point of view and from a business point of view? What kinds of decisions and issues are we likely to be addressing? How do we want to behave and act in terms of execution of strategy, etc.? And you're going to hear me say some things about emotions as we go through. So preparing our minds is basically taking these verbs on the left-hand side and asking ourselves some pretty tough questions around the world that we're heading into, whether we like it or not. Okay? The other side of the coin, however, is coming back, and I like to say, let's look at what's going on between our ears. And, you know, the old neuroscience observation here, the mind is as the brain does, is very, very critical. The mind is as the brain does, because it's really the brain that is obviously driving the mind. And I pulled out a couple of quotes here that I wanted to address from the point of view of what's happening between our ears and connecting it back to this world that we're looking at out here. And I'm going to take them in reverse order, actually. Those of us who have been schooled in systems theory in our PhD programs, and which John Prescott and others no doubt are still teaching, makes one very simple point, and it's very critical to intelligence work. Our human mind has extraordinary difficulty with systems that have multiple interactions that move very quickly and that occur simultaneously. Our brains, in an explicit sense, don't deal with that world very well. And that's got some major implications that I'll address later on for why we prepare our minds for intelligence work and how we do so. Many of you are probably familiar with Thomas Kuhn's work on the structure of revolutions in science. And he has a phrase that's always stuck with me about interpretation being a human process, but it's very different for different individuals because we're coming at the world from very different places. And the point that he makes is again very relevant to preparing the mind. People presented with the same set of facts generally draw very different interpretations, come to very different conclusions, and make very different recommendations. That's got profound implications for preparing the mind. And a person that you might not think I would be familiar with, but is one of my favorites, is a guy named David Hartman, who is actually an Israeli-based philosopher of religions. And he had this quote that caught my attention also. All of these monolithic frameworks that are in our minds, all of the ideologies that are in our minds, all of the fundamentalist tendencies that we see all around us, inhibit creating a critical, reflective mind. And where there's only one view, one self-evident truth, one ideology between the ears, we don't challenge what's out there in the world. We don't reflect on new data coming into us, and creativity goes out the window. Okay? And Howard Gardner, who's my favorite theorist on the mind, long time Harvard professor, here's the quote I want to bring in here. Our minds are changed either because we want to change them or something happens in the real world or in our mental life that warrants a major change. Now note how that Howard Gardner observation runs right into three bottom observations, because what's between our ears, the monolithic frameworks, our inability to deal with systems, multiple forms of interpretation, okay, don't enable us in many respects to change our minds or have our minds changed for us. Now, the combination of these two is something that I like to work with folks doing intelligence work. And here's where I want to do a little personal note. Over the last probably 15 years in particular, one of my personal intelligence struggles has to do with the first words up here. We see the world not as it is, but as we are. So if I've been a long-term employee of Company X, and I've inhaled their culture, their perspective, their way of looking at the world, I see the world not as it is out there, but through the lens of the particular company that I'm engaged with. Okay? I could crack a joke here that that doesn't happen to professors, but it truly does. They're the best exemplars of the philosophy we're talking about here. The other part of the struggle that I've been involved in, again, coming out of some stuff in neuroscience, this triangle of thinking, emotions, and behavior, it's literally impossible to disentangle. Okay? Emotions influence everything that we do, that we say, that we think about. Okay? And so when I work in organizations and somebody says, let's take emotions out of this, okay, it's a bizarre statement, okay, and reflects amazing and stunning ignorance on the part of the person who's professing it. Okay? And also coming out of neuroscience, the third one here, how do I know what I think until I see what I write? Okay? Writing forces us to get our brains working in ways that generate stuff that completely surprise us. And to come back to the emotion side again, what we say is often not what subconsciously we feel. And neuroscience has taught us very convincingly that it's our subconscious emotions that really drive what we say, really drive our behaviors, really drive our reaction. If that were not true, the whole purpose of brands would go out the window. Okay? So if you take those four neuroscience-based observations at the top and take it down to the bottom, it has some major implications for why we need to address this topic of structuring our minds, preparing our minds for doing intelligence work. Okay? If you take those four top ones as a given, the implications are critical. The whole notion of personal objectivity is pure myth. It cannot exist. Okay? We cannot attain objectivity unless we're engaging with others. To be objective means we engage with multiple other people, we share thoughts, we share perspectives, etc. And a lot of what we believe, what we take as true about the world outside, about relationships, is mythology. Now, this is particularly relevant to intelligence work, because as intelligence work I'll talk about in a moment, it's all about understanding change, anticipating change, projecting change, and looking at its implications. And because of those top four in many respects, our minds, and again, no news to anybody, is full of all kinds of biases that Daniel Kahneman has clearly brought to our attention and showed us how to deal with them. Okay? So again, why we're dealing with this topic of preparing our minds to do intelligence work is largely because how our brains operate, captured in this particular page here, in many respects is detrimental to the intent and objective of doing intelligence work. Now, a focus, and maybe the focus of intelligence work in my view, is in large measure creating meaning for others. Okay? What does competitor change mean in terms of our products, our organizations, our strategy? What does it mean in terms of our competitors are going? What does it mean in terms of how the marketplace will be structured, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So from an intelligence point of view, in shaping our minds and preparing our minds, we really have to develop a deep understanding of mental models and business models, what they are, how they're connected, how they interact, what we need to do to unravel them, test them, challenge them, etc. Okay? And unfortunately, what I see in a lot of companies and in a lot of writing in the business strategy area, in the business intelligence area, etc., is a failure to understand that in many respects, unless we affect mental models, we can't do good intelligence work, and nor can we shift the interpretation of business models that resides in the heads of managers, executives, and many others. Okay? So when we come back and look at mental models, as many of you know, what we're really doing here is coming back and doing reflection at both the individual, the team or group level, and the organizational level. Because the basic raw naked truth here is that within every company, there's a dominant, prevalent, enduring, widely dispersed, deeply enmeshed mental model about how we do business. Okay? Why our products are successful, what our value proposition is, why it works, the dominant assumptions we have about the world around us, projections we're making about the future, and in particular, this whole notion of explanations of why we're successful or not successful, why our strategy wins or loses. So one step in preparing our minds for intelligence work is to come back and be brutally critical in explicating what our mental model is. And in particular, to pick up on something John Prescott was referring to a few moments ago, what's our mental model about intelligence, about doing intelligence, why we do intelligence, how we do intelligence, etc., and making that very explicit, and therefore, as we'll talk later on, critical to developing our minds for doing this kind of work. And I put on the bottom there, remember, the future is a cognitive construction. Obviously, the future doesn't exist. So we create pictures of the future, and those pictures of the future become critical to how we see the world, what comes out of intelligence work, etc. Okay? So the connection I want to make here, first of all, is coming back and really explicating our mental model, which I'll come back to later on and talk about how to do that. On the other side is the whole question of business models. In essence, how do we make money in this business? Why are we successful in this business? How does our value proposition win or lose, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, okay? So to prepare our minds for intelligence work, we need to pay attention to both mental models and business models and how the two connect, okay? To build on that a little bit, okay, I want to take another aspect of preparing the mind for intelligence work. And this is one that I've been struggling with, and we've been struggling with in our Intelligence Leadership Forum, where we meet every 3 times a year dealing with intelligence issues. And one of the big issues that cropped up over the last number of years is the interplay between deliberations and what we call methods, okay? I think this is a fair statement, and John Prescott and others come back and discuss it later on. If you go through a business school, you get the impression that the world comes down to having the right analytical method with the right kinds of data to do the right kinds of analysis, and lo and behold, mysteriously, majestically, out will come the right kinds of outputs that will influence the right kinds of decisions that will be getting the right kinds of way. I'm slightly tongue-in-cheek here, but I'm also slightly serious. Because as you live in an organization, what you quickly observe that it's not just the analysis tools, techniques, and methodologies that we have, it's the conversations around them that are even more critical. Okay? I'll give you a recent example of this. We're deep into an industry analysis. We got all kinds of outputs in all kinds of forms with spreadsheets coming out to Zoom, etc. And we decided to do something rather radical. We said, let's put all of this good stuff aside. Let's close the darn computers, and let's 6 of us get in front of a whiteboard and just talk to each other, reflect on each other's comments and observations, and focus in on one important question, which was, what assumptions should we be making about the direction of this industry over the next 3 to 7 years? We literally walked away from the data per se, walked away from the analysis outputs, and simply engaged with each other, got each of our minds connected to each other person, and came up with a set of assumptions that we're finding it very difficult to do by sitting in front of our computers and going back and forth with each other with a nice knowledge-based system allowing us to connect in live on the screen. Okay? But once we shifted the mode of deliberating, we got to a point where we seemingly couldn't have gotten to previously. Okay? So as we're thinking about preparing our minds to do intelligence work, we have to address this whole question of deliberations and methods. Okay? Now, go back now to the analysis project that I asked you to take at the beginning. As you're thinking through that analysis project, where are the major points of deliberations going to come in? Where are the big conversations going to take place? How do you want to manage those conversations? Okay? Who do you want to have involved in those conversations? Okay? As part of those conversations, how do you want to identify the reasoning that is going on? How do you want to identify the data is being used, and especially the data is not being used? Okay? How do you want to identify the biases, personal, interpersonal, company, etc., that are influencing the content of the analysis methods and influencing the deliberations that are taking place? Okay? So what we do here, and again, my personal struggle in thinking through and the doing of intelligence work and analysis, is managing that interpersonal side as part of the analysis process and being prepared to do it and seeing it as part of a normal process. Okay? So that's another link in the whole world of preparing the mind for intelligence work. Now let me come to another piece here. This is probably the most important part of the conversation I'm having with you today. So I wanted to make sure we get this fairly clear. Okay? Think about what's between your ears. There's an understanding of a business model and an understanding of mental models. And the interaction between them gives us some sense of a worldview about our business, our firms, our competitors, marketplace, technology, you name it. However, most of that current view lies tacitly in our minds, buried in our brains. Okay? And a lot of that content rarely comes forward, not discussed, not critiqued, not challenged. Okay? But it's that content between our ears that shapes the analysis we want to do. I call it an inquiry system, for want of a better phrase. So we go out and we do a project, we create some data, we do some analysis. It could be scenario work, it could be competitor gaming work, it could be forecasting a competitor strategy moves, it could be the next wave of technology change, it could be looking at the emerging discontinuities or disruptions in the industry, who knows what. And out of that analysis comes a whole host of outputs that come in various forms. And we usually get to recommendations, and we go ahead and we get them organized, and we get them into the organization, and we get them affecting strategy, and it gets executed over time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? However, let's stop here. We're talking about preparing the mind to do intelligence work. Okay? So we've got to be insistent on two kinds of backward loops. The top loop is where we're executing the analysis work, executing the outputs, executing the strategy. That practice loop has got to come back, and we've got to ask ourselves, how is what we're seeing in practice here influencing our understanding of the relevant business model and influencing our mental model? So preparing our minds to do intelligence work, we've got to be insistent, absolutely insistent on that practice feedback loop, where all the time we're coming back and saying, how is this affecting my mental model of how we do intelligence work? How is it affecting my mental model of what's happening in the world outside? How is it affecting my mental model of current emerging discontinuities, disruptions, who knows what? The bottom loop, okay, is where we reflect at a purely intellectual level or conceptual level, and we come back and we really address the mental model and the business model. The practice model looks at how we do the work. The conceptual model looks at what's underneath. Okay? And this is where, in working with teams doing work, you can generate unbelievable insight into how we think about the world, how our mental model is structured, why it needs it. So, simple example, it's almost real time. Scenario work in a construction industry where we're looking at alternative views of the future by definition, given that it was scenarios. Developed out these scenarios, looked at robust implications, looked at strategy implications, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. What became very interesting in a major learning experience, however, was when we engaged in those two feedback loops. And on the practice loop, what became very, very clear was an interesting new way of doing scenario work with multiple teams and doing it much faster and much better, which I now call fast loop scenario work. Okay, fast cycle scenario work, because the learning that we got from this set of scenarios taught us how to do it much more quickly, much more effectively, engage much more groups, manage the deliberations in a very different way. And that really affected the how to do side of the business model and the mental model going forward. The conceptual loop was very interesting because what it did, again, no surprise from scenarios, was it challenged the heck out of elements in our mental model. The assumptions that we historically had about the industry, okay, about the players in the industry, about what would cause success in the industry, the kinds of assets and capabilities you require to be successful in the industry, the nature of the alliance partners you would see in the industry, all were critical to our mental model around the industry going forward, all of which fundamentally shifted. Now, one of the important points here is doing this explicitly on paper, where we're looking at the emerging new assumptions and beliefs about the industry, comparing them to the old assumptions and beliefs about the industry, none of which, by the way, were in the company's strategic plan, surprise, surprise, and then force-fitting the comparison between the old and the new, and getting a significant agreement around what assumptions we want to take into the future. So preparing the mind to do intelligence work is all about, for me, preparing the mind to engage in the practice loop and in the conceptual loop, so that we're upgrading, updating, and improving how we do intelligence work and the content of it in terms of business models and mental models. Okay, and the two quotes that I love to use to drive these points home is one I picked up from an old French philosopher: "Theory does not keep things from happening." Okay? So the best theories that we have embedded in our mental models doesn't prevent things from happening. And on the practice loop, experience is often the greatest inhibitor to learning. Experience meaning this is how we've always done things around here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So that to me is the core of what I'm talking about today. I thought I would just hit you with some quick comments out of this work, where people came to realize that preparing the mind was critical to doing better intelligence work. I won't read through them. You can see what they are there, but everybody recognizing that without any problem, we clearly have to come back and do better work. Okay. What I'd like you to do as a challenge to preparing your mind for better intelligence work, pick your favorite analysis tool. I don't care what it is. It could be scenario work. It could be the 5 forces. It could be your favorite projection tool. It could be Delphi work. I really don't care what it is. Pick any tool you have. Okay? And ask this very simple question: where should our analysis focus be? Okay? And I've picked my favorite, one of my favorites out of insight work, where we go through the 4 I's: indicators, inferences, insight, implications. Okay? And we ask the question, from an analysis point of view, how should we prepare our mind to do these kinds of work? What has to be different about our mind going forward compared to what it was? Again, I won't bore you with the details here. I'll just use some very simple examples. A very powerful one that still is prevalent in observing the work I'm doing with companies: understanding the fundamental difference between data and indicators. That is lost on a lot of folks who get buried in, well, I'll give you an example. I'm working with a very good intelligence professional who has got more data than God knows even existed, buried in all kinds of portals, spreadsheets, etc. And we ask a very simple question. What are the indicators out of that data that we should be monitoring to anticipate where three competitors are going and where the industry is going? And the only answer he could give us was, that's a really good question. We haven't gotten to answer it yet. Okay? So if your mind is not prepared to make a distinction between data and indicators, obviously it's not something that you do. Okay? Fundamental to any project, any intelligence project, is drawing inferences about data from indicators, etc. Okay? If we don't draw inferences because we're projecting futures, we're dealing with the futures, we can't get from the past to the present to the future. Okay? Again, preparing the mind to draw inferences. Are we aware of the levels of inferences that we need to deal with? Are we aware of the inferencing process that is always out there? Do we know how to avoid the classic errors in doing inferencing work? One very simple one that I find all the time, we'll get an indicator from a competitor. Let's say it's a new product launch. Okay? People will draw one inference from it and they're done. But in fact, from that new product launch, you could draw multiple different inferences about the competitor's motivation, their intent, their behavior, the next steps in their go-to-market, etc. Insight, which has sort of been where I focused for the last 5 years, truly understanding what insight is. I'll come back to this later on. Okay, the types and levels of insight. What gives a reasonable guarantee that we actually have an insight? How do we validate an insight? Okay, if our mind is not prepared by understanding the answers to these kinds of questions, we're going to be severely handicapped in doing insight work. Then on the implications end, do we really understand what's meant by implication insight? By which I mean very high level on new understanding, which again I'll talk about later on, as distinct from the implications of what we do, how we do it, etc. Okay, so pick your favorite analysis tool or technique that's in your analysis project, and ask yourself, where should our focus be in terms of enhancing analysis, and is our mind prepared to deal with that? Again, I won't bore you with the details here. I just pick a couple of examples where we've spent a lot of time getting individuals' minds prepared to do better intelligence work. Every dog and its mother nowadays is into large data. Okay? As if the world did not exist before the notion of large data hit us. Okay? Well, here's an observation I would make that's critical to getting people's minds prepared to do good intelligence work. Okay? Almost every example of major insight with major business implications that I've been involved in and worked on over the last 7 or 8 years has come from small data, not from big data. Now, this is not an argument against big data and how big data is used, etc., etc. But it is an argument that if your mind is not prepared to address small data and extract solid inferences from small data and think about the implications of the inference from small data, you miss a lot of the capability of intelligence work. One of my favorite examples is a consumer goods company where a male brand manager was sitting down with a poor unfortunate lady in her basement doing her weekly wash. Right? And he was talking to the lady about the problems and issues involved in doing the wash, and was stupid enough to talk about where's your pain points. Okay? And she looked at him and said, if you idiots were as good as you are, as you think you are, I wouldn't be using this container and turning it upside down into my washer. You guys would create a liquid. That little insight resulted in $750 million of business within 3 years. Okay? Very small data leading to a major insight, etc. Another example, I had a recent experience, senior executive, B2B example, was talking with a customer who told them why their technology was having a particular problem. Small data, goes back home, talks with his engineers, discovers it's a solvable problem. Within a month, they've got the problem solved, and had dramatic impact on their positive cash flow for that year. Okay? So if our minds are not prepared to look for small data, be attentive to small data, extract value from small data, it ain't going to happen. Okay? The same is true down at the bottom end on insight. Okay? If we're not really willing and understanding of how to create insight out of multiple inferences, it's simply not going to happen. Okay? So again, take your favorite analysis process or processes, okay, go through them in terms of the steps involved in the analysis, look at what's good or bad, look at how they might be improved, and get that firmly involved in the minds of people in the work that you're doing and embed it in them so that now you can know it's there, know how to do it, learn from it fast, and do better, far more efficient and effective competitor analysis or competitive analysis, etc. Okay. Let me shift gears and deal with some classic issues that we've been involved with in how do we prepare our minds at a very general level, but with very specific implications. Okay. And this is where you have to take on the challenge of a closed mind. Okay. Every one of us has largely a closed mind, whether we like it or not, okay? Because we're seeing what's already between the ears. We're looking for data to confirm our hypotheses, our inferences, our presuppositions, etc. And we think in the same way, no matter what happens. In the political election that's now going on, we are looking at a classic challenge of closed minds, okay? We see it all over the place. I will say no more, I will move on. Recognizing that all of us have a closed mind to a large extent, what do we do? Okay? The basic orientation is to do something that is very difficult to do, which would be the focus of consideration right now. We've got to take three different but highly related modes and expose them, express them, get them down on paper, subject them to critique, get others involved, etc. Number one is our cognitive modes. Okay? The assumptions, presuppositions, projections, etc. that are buried in our mind that I've talked about already. We need to get those made explicit so that we can reflect on them, converse about them, and decide to change them if need be. The second is our analysis modes and methods and routines. How we do analysis, etc. We've got to be brutally critical in creating many questions about analysis modes. Let me just give you a recent example. We were doing a quasi-industry structure analysis, but more in terms of projecting where the industry would be 5 years out, okay? The team put in place the 5 forces analysis, classic and known to everybody. And we did something very simple. We switched the mode of analysis to ecosystems and created a very complex ecosystem analysis, looking at all of the stakeholders, all of the interactions, all of the changes taking place. And we saw the whole world very, very differently because we switched the analysis mode. Okay. Another example recently on customer analysis, with all kinds of analysis being done on voice of the customer. Really good work. Okay? We switched the mode of analysis. Let's look at a customers through an emotional lens. Okay? What are the dominant emotions that are reflected by customers in their words, in their complaints, in their behaviors, in their purchase choices, etc.? And we suddenly saw customers fundamentally differently than we did through the classic historic customer voice of customer analysis. Okay, deliberation modes. Here's how do we engage with others, and obviously these three are highly interrelated. Okay, again, look at how people engage with each other, converse with each other as you're going through analysis. Okay. The classic example here that all of us will have seen is the senior most person sits at the top of the table, and everybody in the room looks at him or her to pick up on the signals, to understand where he or she is at, and that dominates the entire engagement. Okay. And the phrase I love here that I picked up from somebody recently, some people are more certain of everything than I am of anything. Okay. So this is this step one in beginning to deal with and getting to a more open mind. And that connects back to the point, which is profoundly critical in preparing our minds for doing intelligence work. Okay. The non-referential mind kills us. Okay. And that is recognizing the following. As individuals, we cannot know whether and how our mind's understanding of the world is adequate or inadequate. It is simply impossible. Okay. So the self-reference is coming back to ourselves and loving our own opinions, our own judgments, etc., etc. Okay. The consequences here can obviously be devastating to any kind of work, but especially to intelligence work. And what to do, again, goes back to making explicit the key elements of our mental model, our cognitive assessment, etc. But here's where getting to and understanding the power of the questions got to do with our mental model, or not just our mental model, but preparing our minds to do intelligence work becomes very important. We have to expose our judgments, our critiques, how we do things to others, and get critique from others to get some degree of objectivity we talked about before, and creating structured deliberations around those critiques. Where we put together a set of questions and pursue them and allow people to have their observations, to get their sixth sense worked in, etc. Okay? And one of the things that crops out of those conversations is the commitment to adjusting not just our mental models, but our business models as a consequence of this. Okay? A phrase that I love that's attributed to John Maynard Keynes is, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? Okay. Now that's critical here because that comes back, we're talking to ourselves. Okay. When the observations are made that are critical of me, do I change my orientation? Do I change my mind? Do I change how I do things, etc.? What do you do, sir? Okay. The next part of these three basic observations has to do with preparing our minds to deal with ambiguity. Okay. One would presume that anybody in the intelligence world is prepared to deal with ambiguity, indeed loves dealing with ambiguity, desires ambiguity, and wants to work with ambiguity. Would that were true. Okay? I fall into this trap, I suspect you do as well, because very often we will take a single or sole description or explanation of change and basically run with it. Okay? But think about for a moment the consequences of this. If we have a single depiction of the industry, okay, or a single explanation of why customers are behaving as they are, and we take that as golden, it actually conceals far more than it reveals. Okay? So what I've been trying to do with folks is take them through situations where we'll deal with it as if it's a messy or a wicked problem. Okay? So we're doing industry analysis. Let's think about this as a completely messy or wicked problem. If we're looking at customers' behaviors, let's look at it as a messy or wicked problem. If we're looking at developing projections of where the industry will be, let's think about it as a messy or wicked problem. Okay, and what that causes us to do is to create very different definitions of what the problem is, what the issue is, etc. So different definitions of where's the industry going, different definitions of what's causing the competitor to do something, okay? And that takes us back to very basic systems thinking. What are the other entities in the external world? How are they linked to each other? What are the causal connections we're seeing or not seeing? And that involves taking very different perspectives from different stakeholders. It's coming back and elaborating the classic presumptions in competitive gaming. Let's step into the shoes of different competitors, different customers, regulatory agencies, etc. And then develop different assumption sets relevant to the context of the problem, and then develop alternative pathways forward. That is a lot of work. And you only do it when it's a significant issue of major business relevance, of major consequence to your organization strategy, etc. But it's critical to have the mind prepared to do that kind of work. If our mind is not prepared to take on messy or wicked issues or contexts or problems, obviously there's no way that we can do it. So one of the key challenges in preparing our minds for intelligence work is making sure that we understand what's involved conceptually and from a practice point of view in doing messy or wicked problem solving. And by the way, the link back to the two feedback loops that I talked about earlier can be profound if we take a messy or wicked problems approach to dealing with problems. Inherent in that is a mind that creates tension among ideas or perspectives or points of view. And intentionally, and I mean this, intentionally creates different assumptions, different perspectives, use different customers to create their perspective on your value proposition, et cetera, set them up, make sure they're explicit, and ask people to take each perspective and build the argument around that perspective, that shareholder, that point of view, and have our minds prepared to do this. It's really the only way that we can get to create ambiguity and deal with ambiguity as a way of having our minds prepared to do this kind of work, okay? And at the back end is then integrating these to get to higher level assumptions, higher level perspectives, and creating meaning. What does this mean for us, okay? Cynthia, can I ask a question? How much time do I have left? Sorry, I'm not hearing you.
Okay, so yes, we have this session until 12:45. So
Okay.
yeah, a few minutes before that, we'll do some wrap up where I can get people off to the next step.
But I just want to make sure. I just
Yeah.
want to make sure. Thank you.
you.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Let me now come to two basic items around preparing the mind for intelligence work that are implicit in everything I've talked about so far, but now I want to make them explicit. Any output that we create in intelligence is a function of the interaction between data and reasoning. Okay. No insight there. Okay. But we've got to come back and prepare our minds to deal with both data and reasoning. Okay. And make sure that we're explicit in data and reasoning issues, and make sure that we connect them back to those two feedback loops. Okay. So let me take reasoning first, because reasoning, almost by definition, overpowers data. But we're generally unaware of how that happens, why that happens, when that happens. Our brain is largely on automatic pilot. Okay. And the Model 1 and Model 2 that Daniel Kahneman has talked to us about, both are very operative in dealing with tacitly how our brain deals with reasoning and deals with data. Okay. So what I wanted to do here was have us come back to your intelligence project. Okay. And let's talk about and think about reasoning in the context of that intelligence project, or indeed any intelligence project. Okay. And the items I put out here on the left-hand side are usually things that we would go through when we get into serious conversation about what reasoning is prevailing in this project, what's the source of this reasoning, how is it influencing how we're thinking about the analysis in this project, how is it influencing the outputs that we're generating, the conclusions we're generating, etc. I won't go through each one of these, but each one is very relevant to thinking about the prevalence of the inhibitors to reasoning that are at work in our organizations and between our brain, between our ears, that we're not even aware of. I'll take a couple just for emphasis, okay? There's rarely one best way of reasoning, okay? Rarely. I love working with finance people who do nothing but finance analysis on a spreadsheet and think that that's the only way that you can reason about business issues, that you have an influence on strategy, etc. Okay? So I would generally ask them a very simple question. As a matter of interest, What assumptions are you making in those financial numbers about competitors' products, where technology is heading, regulatory disruptions that might take place, or our ability to execute the strategy? And I'll usually get back the answer, either the people who prepared the work have taken care of that, of dubious import, of course, okay? But you want to get them to come back and think about different ways of doing analysis to get to the implications that they have provided, to get to the best way of generating the most positive cash flows in the next 2 or 3 years. Okay? So as a matter of rule, as a matter of course, in terms of preparing the mind to do intelligence work, think about, are there alternative reasoning modes that we can create in doing work? Very simple reasoning mode we've used many times: the strongest possible arguments in support of a point of view, the strongest possible counter arguments, and then play them out and see how they come out, okay? Reasoning, because it's done by our brains and because our brains are festooned with biases, be very clear on what biases are at work. There are always, of course, hidden biases. So to prepare our minds to do intelligence work, we have to be prepared to be very serious in identifying not just the biases, but the implications of the biases, okay? Another recent one in terms of bias that was completely not attended to was the bias embedded in our culture, corporate culture, of where we did the following in our analysis, okay? We depended entirely on an external consulting firm for industry forecasts. Okay? An incredible bias in those analyses done by people who are very knowledgeable, but their biases were embedded in the way that they saw the industry emerging. Okay? We then came back and said, okay, let's look at what their biases might be. Well, it turned out they were all technology experts, and therefore the biases had to do with technologies, but within a defined domain of technology. When we moved to another kind of technology and saw that that technology had the potential to generate substitute products that would decimate the products in our business, the bias became very clear and very consequential. Okay? It, of course, led to a whole new set of questions being asked of the consulting firm when those biases got revealed. Okay? One other one that I want to emphasize here is that reasoning very often has no easy retrospective explanation. That is, we find it very difficult to explain how we reasoned our way to a certain outcome. So we have to, in preparing our minds to do intelligence work, we have to be willing to unravel the reasoning that was in place, okay? The steps that were involved, okay? The analysis work that was done, the kinds of data that was used, the judgments that were made that led to the outcome that was presented, okay? So reasoning, as of course, is always about making judgments, but very often those judgments are not made explicit. Okay? So in preparing the mind to do intelligence work, we have to be obsessive in making sure that we identify the relevant judgments at different parts of the reasoning process and how they influence the outcome. Okay? That's thinking about reasoning. On the right-hand side, I put in a set of actions that we've adopted at various points in conversations around reasoning from an intelligence point of view. Again, I won't go through all of them. You can see what they are here. My suggestion is to take each of them and add to them from your own knowledge, your own experience, in terms of the actions you would want to take to both reveal the reasoning that's at place and how to deal with the reasoning and how to address it and how to reframe it perhaps in terms of getting to different kinds of outputs, okay? The two that I always emphasize is the following: the benefits and the limitations of different modes of reasoning, okay? So how you build an argument, how you build a point of view, how you build your business case may have inherent in it some benefits, but also some severe limitations, okay? And some of the limitations may be, for example, the 2 or 3 of us who built the business case We all came from the same perspective. We all had the same biases. We've all worked in the company for 25 years or whatever, okay? Got to have a mindset that's willing to identify what those limitations are, etc. Okay. I won't deal with the evidence when that's coming up on data, but I will build on the one that I referenced on the left-hand side, and that is building conflict into different modes of reasoning where they're intentionally conflictual, okay? Where you intentionally intentionally build different business cases that lead to different outcomes, and then you come back and you compare and you contrast. Okay? Very critical in terms of having our mind prepared to do that kind of work so that we don't fall into the trap of a single reference point, a single mode of reasoning, a single way of doing things. Okay? That's the reasoning side. The sister side to reasoning is data. Okay? And this one we could spend a day on. We'll spend 5 minutes. Okay. Our implicit mental models, what's sitting between our ears, literally dictates what kinds of data we want to work with, what kinds of data sources we prefer, how we like to see data transmitted to us, how we organize data, in what form, okay, and how we use it. So I would submit to you that everything got to do with data, okay, is driven by what's between our ears and how our brain functions. Now, by data here, I mean, in the widest possible sense, all inputs into analysis. So data here could include, as I mentioned a moment ago, outputs of a consulting firm who've done work for us. It could be our own internal analysis outputs. It could be conversations with people. It could be survey work. It could come from any source. I'm lumping everything in here into data. Okay? So I'm preparing our minds to deal with data. The set of elements that are on the left-hand side, each one has got to be addressed and addressed very carefully. Okay? Because we can't take data for granted, etc. Basic questions are following. To what extent does any set of data reflect the reality or the world it represents? And the answer clearly, not completely. Can never do that by definition. So the question really is, how incompletely is it? Okay? So if you get a set of data on a competitor, and you've got their behaviors, their actions, their motivations. You got intense descriptions of what they've done, how they've done it, why they've done it, etc. You've got projections all around where they're going, how they're going, etc., etc., etc. Basic question, does that truly reflect the motivations that are driving the competitor? Well, it may or may not. Okay? So then from that perspective, our minds need to be prepared to deal with data as if it's always in question, because it is. Okay, data is always contaminated. If it's prepared by somebody, it's contaminated by that person. And the biases are always going to be there. Here's a big one with data: privileging particular sources or particular people. Okay, we have our own outside experts. We go to them. Obviously valuable. But why not go to another kind of expert? Why not go to a person with a very different point of view? Okay, and then use those 2 points of view, those 2 kinds of data to understand the differences. Okay, big one for me is the following. Data out of context makes no sense. So if you tell me here's what the competitor is going to do, but I don't have a good sense of what's happening in the competitive context, okay, very difficult to interpret your recommendation of what the competitor or assertion of the competitor is going to do. Okay, I've covered the small data one already, won't deal with that. Volume of data gets overplayed in my view. It's nice to have a lot of data, but come back and really ask, what are the critical indicators in this data set that we ought to be paying attention to and monitoring as an indicator of where the world is going? Okay, so I just put those 8 items on the left-hand side as questions, issues, concerns that we ought to be continually raising about data and data we're using, data we're obtaining from others, how we manage data, etc. What to do on the right-hand side, of course, is the set of actions that we need to take, both in the form of questions that we raise and behaviors that we should engage in. Many of them I've covered already in the conversation so far, but one I really will emphasize again out of recent experience is making sure we explore the context of data. Okay, what's the context around technology forecasts? Okay, what do we see happening in the competitive area? Who has made that forecast? What is their particular competitive context? Okay, so again, understanding and exploring contexts around data so that we understand the data in context and not the data in isolation. Okay, and I love the phrase at the bottom that somebody's told me: facts are like cows, you look them in the eye and they disappear. Okay, data very often, when it's presented as facts, you look them in the eye and they do disappear because we don't have the context. Okay, so preparing our minds to do insight work, to do analysis work, to do intelligence work, be very careful in the questions and issues we raised around data. Okay. At the very beginning here, we started off making the observation that intelligence work is all about creating meaning. It's all about mental models, okay? And the mental models' influence on meaning. The intervening variable is of course insight, okay? And that's where I've been spending a lot of my time in the last number of years. Preparing our mind to do insight work really starts with understanding what insight is and isn't, okay? Every clown and its mother in any organization I've worked in will always pop up and say, well, I just had an insight. Here's my insight. And the insight could be a simple fact. It could be an observation. Who knows what it is? When our minds are prepared to do good intelligence work, we'll have to work with a definition of insight so that we understand what it is. I can get through the straw and a lot of the meandering that takes place around conversations and intelligence. Insight for me is very simple. It's new understanding that makes a difference to thinking, decision-making, and action. Where the new understanding will be contrasted with the old understanding, and there'll be a powerful difference between the two. And so as an example of new understanding that came up here about maybe 2 years ago, we were doing an industry analysis using scenarios, and the insight that emerged was that 3 technologies were going to become much more interlinked and create new product solutions that was going to give rise to massive new opportunities to people inside the industry currently and outside. So the new understanding was how the technologies were going to come together to create new marketplace opportunity. That was fundamentally different than the old understanding, which was that technology shifts were going to happen slowly and we'd be able to take care of them as they evolved. Okay. So that new insight led to a completely new set of meanings about what was going to take place in the industry, where we needed to be, and created fundamental new meaning for the executive team in terms of their perspective on the world around them. Okay? So a significant new insight that meets the test of new understanding is going to involve a lot of explanation. Okay? So that new insight for us explained what companies were doing in developing technologies. It explained what some consulting firms were beginning to look at and proposals they were making to clients. And it explained why some of our internal R&D folks were getting increasingly concerned about the direction of our R&D strategy. Okay? So powerful insight is a powerful means of explanation of change happening in the world. And then I want to talk a little bit about insight validation and preparing our minds for doing intelligence work. Because insights generally deal with the future, we cannot validate an insight today. Okay? We can build strong reasoning for the insight, We can build a powerful business case for the insight, but we cannot validate it. Validation of insight only takes place over time, where we observe what's happening in the external world and we ask, is our understanding embedded in the insight holding true or not? So critical then is getting at the indicators by which we will track the alleged insight over time and confirm or disconfirm the insight, amend the insight, and of course then the implications in terms of the meaning that we extract from the insight. If our mind is prepared to do that kind of work, if we understand what that insight means, then we're much more powerfully positioned to do good intelligence work, generating real meaning that's of relevance to our internal clients, etc. Last piece I just mentioned here on insight that's turned out to be very important that we developed over the course of work is what we call implication insight. That is new high-level understanding of business implications. Example, implication could be, an example I gave a moment ago, our R&D strategy needs to change. That doesn't tell us how we change it, when we change it, what the change is going to be, but that high-level implication is our R&D strategy needs to change. Another high-level implication that almost always emerges, taking us back to the backward loops on mental models, is shifts in our underlying assumptions. Okay? So we have to shift our underlying assumption from the industry growth rate is going to be 10% per year down to 3% per year. Our underlying assumption is the competitor is going to introduce the product in 6 months and not in 18 months or 24 months as previously suggested. That implication insight for us can be very profound and critical. So the observation here is preparing our minds to develop implication insights before getting down into the nitty-gritty and details of the business implications in terms of the recommendations, the strategy changes, etc. Okay? So the bottom line here for me in preparing our minds to do intelligence work is we need to be obsessed, absolutely obsessed on the generation of insights as the pathway to creating new meaning for the relevant people that we're working with and for ourselves as intelligence professionals. Okay? So I'll wrap up here in preparing our minds to do intelligence work. Okay? The first one is an obvious one, but it needs to be emphasized. Take a time out and just reflect on ourselves, on the extent to which our minds are prepared or not prepared, the biases we have, etc., etc. Okay, how we do things, how we observe things. The patterns will be there. They will be observable mostly to others, but just take a time out as an intelligence team and or as an individual, recognizing what I said before, that self-referential, pay attention. We cannot, looking only at ourselves, understand whether our view of the world is adequate or inadequate. Okay. Be brutal, be absolutely brutal in your individual or collective self-assessment. Okay. And how we reason, in what data we use, what data we don't use. Do we really come back and execute those feedback loops? Okay. Critical. Engage others in the process. Okay. And create the climate and the culture in the group where you can reflect on both the elements in the analysis process, the elements in the reason, the elements in the data, okay? And be willing to deal with the interpersonal side of it because emotions are going to be in play. You need to manage the emotions in that conversation, okay? And again, emphasizing those do loops in terms of ongoing change in both the business model and change in the mental models that are always in practice. One piece of advice that we've done a few times, just take a project and go through it. Map through what was done, how it was done, where your mind was prepared, not prepared, okay? How you want to go back and rechange some elements of the mind for doing this kind of work. Again, being brutal in the self-assessment and assessment of others. Taking a project is a nice way to do it, okay? And then summarize where the preparation of the mind needs to be changed, needs to be amended, okay? but in terms of our understanding, in terms of our practice, in terms of our behaviors, okay? And then just put together a few steps, a few practice steps, a few behavioral steps that you can do individually, that you can do collectively, reflecting, preparation of the mind to do the analysis work. It's a lifelong process. It never changes. And as I look back now on work done 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, I hope to God that nobody has the tapes or the videos. I hope that they're burned. I hope that their memories are clearly consigned to the next world, because it would be nothing but embarrassing. I'm going to stop there. Happy to deal with questions and issues. Love to engage with people, a lot of whom friends and acquaintances.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Liam, for getting us started here. And so for this portion, we'll turn to the Q&As. Many of you who have already hopped on the Q&A panel to share your thoughts and your questions. And so we'll take some of those now. And I'm not going to read the fan notes that we've received. A lot of people have been very, very excited about what you've shared with them, but what we will focus on are the questions.
Yeah.
And so Ken Potter says, Dr. Fahey is right on. I'd love to hear some examples, cases from industry showing application, i.e., for example, showing how he has seen managed conversations for strategic insight work well.
Oh, my friend, you're hitting one of my hot buttons. There's a side of my personality that I like to keep concealed. However, in managing conversations inside organizations, I sometimes have to unleash that side of my personality. Let me give you some examples, general reference points that people can use. These may sound trivial, but they're not. Okay? Think about how the room is organized. Think about who is playing what kind of role. Think about who has what kind of experience and how you want to manage that context. Okay? We've done meetings where the senior most person in the room, we have asked that person not to comment on the comments of anybody else. Okay? Because the members in the room are waiting for a positive or negative reaction from the senior person. Okay? If we're trying to create an open-ended exploratory conversation, okay, where we're getting people to ask questions about the context, okay, the last thing we want to have happen is to have the senior executive in the room pronounce, well, that's a dumb, stupid question, okay? Kills the whole culture of what we're trying to do, okay? Another little tool that we use is having people prepped with a perspective that we want them to bring to bear that we know is going to be opposite of the dominant perspective in the room. Okay? And we'll ask them to build an argument, build a business case, do it very succinctly, okay, and then have people respond to it. Okay? So a lot of tricks in the book, managing conversations around a table. Okay? A different part of managing the conversation from an intelligence point of view is having the intelligence professional meet one-on-one with an executive in a casual context, not necessarily in his or her office, okay, but over a cup of coffee to explore the implications that are flowing from a piece of analysis and get feedback in that way. Okay.
Terrific. Thank you for these ideas and examples, Liam. So Eric Johnson says, the human mind does logic 3 different ways. 1, selection, detecting mostly no more than what's expected to be seen. 2, combination, reconciling what is detected and what is already believed to be known. And 3, evaluation, determining the meaning of this new information for the individual. Yeah. Uncertainty is paralyzing to choice making, because choices imply sacrifice and most humans cannot cope with loss. So how can we help the next generation of leaders humble themselves to these deep human frailties?
Thanks, Eric, for the short question. Eric is getting at the fundamentals of how our brain works. Okay? Those of us who have spent a lot of time working in Germany and in Scandinavia will notice very quickly that brains educated in the cultures of those worlds work very differently than those educated in the US or in Japan or in China. Okay? So to broaden out Eric's question, we've got to recognize the cultures of geographies as well as the cultures of companies. Okay? And the three elements that he mentioned are pretty classic in terms of how brains work. So let me just take an example here. If you think about observing the world, what we perceive as important and relevant, okay, is clearly influenced by our experience, our knowledge, the organizations we work in, etc. Okay, so we have to work at the early stage with affecting how people perceive and observe the world around them. Okay, and there's lots of things that we can do to help people do that. Okay, on the analysis side, the speed with which the brain can connect data knows no bounds. Okay, the speed with which the brain can go from a data point to a strong recommendation is faster than the speed of a mip. Okay, we're just hardwired to do that. Okay, however, when we're doing intelligence or any other kind of work, we've got to deconstruct that process. Okay, so that we're very clear on how we got from a data set, okay, to a set of recommendations at the back end. Okay, so when you go through the inferencing process, what kinds of inferences are being drawn, by whom, how are they being connected? Okay, straightforward analytical work, but to Eric's point, taking out of the brain what's happening in here and getting it outside so that we can reflect on what's happening in the brain. Okay, there are some tools and techniques for doing that in terms of unraveling arguments, unraveling viewpoints, etc., that can be very useful. Okay, and the third point that Eric raised is getting to conclusions and recommendations. The 2 points here that almost always come up. One is looking at the assumptions underpinning a recommendation or a conclusion. Okay, because quite frequently when you expose the underlying assumptions, you expose the rationale that took you from what you thought were your assumptions to the recommendation. Okay? If the assumptions shift, it's highly probable that the reasoning is going to shift and therefore the recommendation is going to shift. Okay? So a very simple exercise of alternative assumptions, related reasoning, getting to recommendations, gets people to recognize that what's happening in the brain, which is happening very, very, very quickly, needs to be unraveled, gotten down on paper, and critiqued. Okay? Once people get into the mode of doing that, you're preparing their minds to do intelligence work or any kind of analysis. Now, I know that's not a full response to Eric's three-part question in the process. I just want to make some points that I've seen relevant to dealing with some of the issues.
Right, terrific. And we also understand too that the system one and system thinking, right, are always competing with one another in our minds as well, right? The emotional and the rational minds. So, and Richard Caldwell asks, how do we prepare our customers' minds for the perspectives we provide? Many times they're surprised, they get news they don't want to hear, and it does not match what they wanted. I've been asked several times to go back and make us look better, make our market bubble look bigger, score us better, don't point out our obvious faults.
Common and classic. Common and classic. There are 2 parts of this. There's the interpersonal side and there's the analytical side. Okay. The interpersonal side is over time building the reputation and the integrity of what you do. Okay. And so if you're a professional in any sphere, and over time you have built up a high level of integrity, professional integrity, okay, it ultimately works wonders for how you are received by others. Okay, and that lays the groundwork for dealing with the analytical side. Okay, And what I encourage people to do when they're dealing with an unwelcoming internal customer or client, okay, is lay the groundwork very carefully for the points that you want to make. Because you've got two options. You can either start with the outcomes of your judgments of your work, or you can build up to them.
Mm.
Okay. Either way, you've got to do it fairly quickly. Okay. So what we try to do is understand the point of view of that other person. Okay. Because the point of view of the other person has a couple of elements to it. As the questioner points out, it may be a matter of not accepting the conclusions. It may be a matter of not accepting the modes of analysis that got you there. And it may be a question of underlying assumptions. Okay? And so if you can figure out the person you're dealing with, it's at the assumption level, it's therefore at the mental model level, that's where you've got to be very careful and very directive in dealing with that person, because if you can get them to understand there's a clash of assumptions here, and there may or may not be evidence for your assumption, for the person you're talking to assumptions, if you can get them at the assumption level, you're well on your way to getting serious conversation around the outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And Liam, you know, what I try to do is I try to actually conduct some analysis to surface people's biases and assumptions from the very beginning, right? I understand those from the start, so that we're not caught short, you know, at the point of delivery, so that we can then use that to lay the groundwork. And I think that allows us, you know, to be able to circumvent some of these issues, you know, so, because they are surface, they are known knowns, right,
Yeah.
for us as project managers, right?
Yeah, but the golden rule is never leave engagement with the internal partner, customer, client until you get to the presentation of findings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. So Roberto Valley asks, what is the role of collaboration on intelligence work? How much do we depend on a shared mindset and a collaborative sense making for intelligence work? What are the key steps for that?
This is a double-edged sword. Okay. You absolutely need collaboration in every respect in doing intelligence work. That almost goes without saying. Okay? Because you need to be able to collaborate with people in different functional areas in the company, different perspectives, different mindsets, different analytical skills and capabilities. Okay, so collaboration at that level is mandatory. Okay, the double-edged sword is the following: are we collaborating within a shared perspective, within a shared mindset, within a shared mentality? Okay. So if we're collaborating and we have a shared mindset which says, this is how we do business, this is how we build a value proposition, this is why we are successful, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that mindset or mental model does not get challenged as part of the collaboration, okay, then you are constrained by the shared mindset, okay? And the shared mindsets can be incredibly enduring, unbelievably embedded into the organization. Okay? So the rule of thumb is essentially then, within collaboration, identify and challenge, okay, where the mindsets, the mentalities, the mental models, okay, are overwhelming and constraining the work that we're actually doing. Okay? A trick that we've used a couple of times is bringing people into the process who have not worked in the company for long or are new employees, or bringing in people externally. Okay? Sometimes actually real customers, okay, we get them involved in the conversation, and my, do they challenge the prevailing mindsets within the collaborative spirit of the group doing the work. Again, pretty rudimentary at one level, but very often difficult to execute.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Claudia Clayton asks, is it a good idea to bring together individuals from different viewpoints so you don't develop bias in one direction too soon? Or are other factors more important in terms of building a CI team to develop good insights?
I guess the question you're raising is, what's the ideal CI team, etc. Okay. Let me address that from 2 points of view. An extraordinarily good CI team leverages knowledge and capabilities and skills that are outside the CI team. Because you can't know all that is required to do good intelligence work and have it embedded in your CI team. So it's very much a question of who can you connect with in your internal network and in your external networks, data source networks, to do the kinds of work that you want to do. Okay, so again, it's going back to some of those reasoning and data items that I identified on the left-hand side, and challenge the heck out of your team along each one of those and saying, where are the deficiencies? Where are the good points? What do we need to correct? How do we correct it, etc. So I'm wary of CI teams that make the presumption they have within us the knowledge, skills, and capabilities to do the work. If you have the team, contact me. I'd love to come talk with you, live with you, and see how you've done it.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And I'll just make a bit of a program note too, that we'll be continuing this conversation and question actually in session 4B tomorrow, talking about how we can expand perspectives to minimize biases and towards diverse teams as well. So I do appreciate that. And finally, as we round things up here for our Q&A in this session, the question is that with today, with the distractions, preoccupations, and the agenda that may exist in organizations, how can intelligence practitioners and organizational managers pursue and recognize small data that matter? You mentioned the importance of small data. So with all the distractions, how can we identify those bits of small data that are important?
Yeah. We live in a world of small data because of the interactions we have with people, the reading we do, etc. Okay? You don't know that a small piece of small data is important or relevant until you draw an inference from it. Okay? So if you're reading a consultant's report, or you're reading a newspaper, or you're reading the Financial Times or whatever, and you see a small data, something pops up at you, okay? The mind has to be trained to draw an inference from that small data. Is that small data really relevant? Okay? Could it have potential? A classic case is people sitting in at a trade show and listening to executives in a competitor talk about their business and where they're going. Okay, now there may well be a throwaway comment by that executive that he or she probably shouldn't have said. Small data by definition. Okay, but that small data is only relevant if we draw an inference from it that says, wait a moment, that piece of small data, I can infer from it something that that competitor is likely to do, or some change is likely to take place in the marketplace. So again, obviously you're going to have all kinds of small data. You're listening to a conversation, you're talking with somebody at a trade show, okay, you're on the phone with somebody, okay? If your mind is prepared to scan for small data, not so much to identify the data, but to draw inferences from it about something that might be important or relevant, that's the trick.
Thank you very much. And so this winds down our discussion with Liam. And with this, I want to thank you, Liam, for giving the summit a thought-provoking and insightful foundation to our session discussions. I made reference to other sessions that will be building off of this, but really all sessions will be building off of this. So I do encourage you to think about what Liam has discussed and presented with us, as we go into these sessions. And keep in mind that we do have these sessions in 2 tracks. So I understand that you can't be in both places at once. These sessions are being recorded, so you can certainly listen to the recordings of the session that you're unable to attend when the recording is out. And so for the rest of the summit, our attendees can please refer to the summit program that you received via email yesterday. So according to the instructions on page 6, to join a session, you simply click on the link in the summit schedule. Those are the tables in blue, and the titles are underlined, so just click on those links, or next to the session title in the description. So there's a join link in orange. And I also want to note that we have virtual exhibits with our partners too. And that's also noted in our summit schedule. And during the virtual exhibit time slot of the summit schedule, you can click on those virtual exhibit links to visit the virtual exhibit hall. And there you'll see our sponsor sites. You can visit those websites. You can chat with some of them in Zoom. And so many of us will also be on the Slack, the CI COP, or the CI Community of Practice that's on Slack. And there's already conversations going on here. Suki Fuller has reported to me. So please do check out the COP on Slack as well throughout the day and join that conversation. And so I just want to note that one of the aspects of the CI Fellows that I value is the collegiality of this group. While it may seem counterintuitive in a community that's built around questions about competitiveness, our collegiality, our shared desire for learning and growth, and our respect and support for one another helps us become better practitioners. And these are also the values that are central to our mission as ambassadors, champions, mentors, and educators, the ACME acronym that John Prescott had referred to. And these are the values that have made this summit possible. So I want to thank my colleagues who joined us here today. Thanks to the summit organizer, Claudia Clayton, and our summit team. And thanks to all the speakers to come. I know you'll enjoy it. And Liam Fahey has certainly kicked things off very, very nicely for us in that regard. And so with that, I will just say enjoy the summit, and please refer to your summit organizer for the rest of the session. There will be no unique link from here on out. It's a matter of just using that PDF and clicking on the links that you want to join. So it's quite simple. So thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you in the sessions. And I do also want to note too, again, that there is the CICOP, or the Community of Practice, that is up and running right now. And so, so join that and enjoy. Thank you.